Good afternoon, Internet, and welcome to Can the Republic Be Rebuilt? A provocative and stimulating discussion, I hope, that will be conducted this afternoon under the auspices of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, which is a institute, officially the country's leading academic institute committed to increasing the scientific understanding of the economic, cultural, and social conditions vital for human flourishing. That's the sort of official slogan. I know the Institute as a tremendous place to have a really wonderful discussion. And I've been lucky enough to participate in and help organize panels like this one for going on several years now, and they've never failed to be stimulating and entertaining. So if you're entertained by this one, I hope you will check out all the other great stuff that IHE does. And I realized that I haven't actually introduced myself. I'm Ross Douthat. I am an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. And when I'm not doing that, I'm a media fellow at IHE, under which eminence I conduct and participate in these conversations. So today I'm joined by two of, I think it's fair to say, America's leading conservative thinkers. First, Yuval Levin, who is the founding and current editor of National Affairs and also the director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And most importantly, for the purposes of this conversation, he is the author of a book that came out about a year ago now called A Time to Build: From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. And he's joined by Christopher Caldwell, who is a contributing editor at the Claremont Review of Books and a contributing opinion writer at my own New York Times. He was previously a senior editor at the Weekly Standard, columnist for the Financial Times, and he's the author of The Age of Entitlement: America Since the 60s, which also came out almost exactly a year ago. And in fact, that was the genesis for the idea that became this event, because both Chris and Yuval and myself, in fact, published books that came out within a month or two of the arrival of the coronavirus on America's shores. And all of our books, but maybe especially Yuval's and Chris's, were focused on sort of the state of the American Republic, the big questions about the fate of our society in the early 21st century. But both of them were, written and their arguments put together before we went through, and obviously continue to go through, the remarkable disturbances of 2020 and 2021. So I thought it would be great to get the two of them together to talk a little bit about not just the arguments they make in the book, but also how their view of the situation, the state of the Republic, as it were, has changed over the course of the coronavirus year. So I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and offer really quick, 1 to 2 to 3 sentence summaries of what I think the core claims of Yuval and Chris's book are, which they can then correct and amend, and then ask them questions about how their theses look and in the light of the last year. And hopefully we will talk for about 35 or 40 minutes and then try and take a few questions. The chat, I think, is open, and if you leave questions there at about 2:45 or 2:50 or so, I will go in and try and fish out a few of the best, the hardest to answer, the most ruthlessly provocative. So that's the preamble. So the books themselves. So I'll start with Yuval, whose book, as his title suggested, was maybe on the more optimistic end of the spectrum of conservative books about America these days. I think you can see the book as kind of a sequel to a earlier, more diagnostic book that Yuval wrote called The Fractured Republic, about sort of the changes in American life since the 1960s, and how the institutions that were sort of existed or were built for the mid 20th century America are now sort of creaking and groaning under the pressures of a very different country and social context. So that was Yuval's last book. And in this book, he focuses on the failures of American institutions, but also a sort of argument for how they can be rebuilt. And in particular, I think Yuval stresses the idea that what we're living through in America right now is a failure to believe in institutions as institutions, whether it's your college or the United States Congress or your church or even your, large successful daily newspaper. People increasingly see the institutions that they inhabit as kind of platforms on which to build a public persona, a brand, something to shout at other people from. I feel personally convicted by this description, of which totally applies to what newspaper columnists do, when in fact successful institutions need to be not just a platform, but a sort of shaping force in which the people involved in them are committed to institutional ends and committed to sort of educating and integrating the next generation into the service of, sometimes obviously the reform of, the institution itself. And so, as fate would have it, we then immediately upon publication of this book got an incredible stress test for American institutions, from sort of the FDA and the CDC to the White House and the Congress, all the way down to your local public school district. And so I'm going to start by asking Yuval, how did we do? How do American institutions look a year after your book came out, and how optimistic or pessimistic are you right now about their future?
Well, thank you, Russ. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation, to learn from you and Chris, two of the wisest observers of this moment, and thanks to the Institute for Human Ecology for bringing us together. First of all, I always resent being called an optimist, and so let me say just a word about that, because I'm not an optimist. I'm a conservative and certainly not an optimist, but I am hopeful. And I think that the distinction between hope and optimism is actually very useful to understanding our circumstances in this moment in America. I think that optimism is just the expectation that good things will happen, and that's silly. I don't think there's anything about our situation that encourages that attitude. But hope is the view that good things could happen, that in a sense, we're not observers of the future. We're participants. It's up to us. So where optimism is the opposite of pessimism, which is also pretty silly, I think of hope as the opposite of despair, which is a sin. And in any case, and you'll correct me if I understand the Christian sin of despair correctly, it only applies really to despair about the church. But I think despair in general is a mistake, and that hope is the right way to think about even a very difficult situation, and maybe especially a very difficult situation. And we are in a pretty difficult situation. If I were writing the book now in the wake of 2020, there are certainly elements of it that would have been darker, more alarmed and more concerned. There are also ways in which some of the more alarmed parts of the argument have been borne out by this year, so that I've been left wishing that I could have used the examples of 2020 to make some of the points of the book. And among other things, could have learned from Chris's book about some things that would have made a lot of the arguments sharper. But to answer, let me maybe emphasize one theme that to me is central to the argument of the book, and that I think has been really key to our experience of the past year. One thing that we saw repeatedly in 2020 was a kind of collapse of trust in expertise, driven by a collapse, particularly, I would say, of self-restraint among experts. And that's a theme of the book, and I think it's crucial to what institutions do for us, both the people who benefit from them and the people who populate them. And this year has really forced us to ask the question, why do we actually trust expertise to begin with? I think we don't just trust experts because they know things that we don't know. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Our sense of how much more they know is waned some in the internet era. But a lot of times we trust experts because they seem somehow to operate under some set of constraints that means that they don't just say anything. They operate under some set of rules that allow us to have some confidence in what they say. We trust an accountant, not just because he understands the carried interest rule, but because there are things an accountant wouldn't do. There are things a lawyer wouldn't do. There are, or ought to be, things that a journalist wouldn't say, right? Why do we trust a journalist? Because there's a process that their work is subject to that imposes some constraints on what they would claim to know. And when we lose trust in them, it's because they seem to escape that process. And as you suggested, to use their profession as a platform to elevate themselves, rather than as a mold of what they do in the world, so that they take a certain form that's easier for us to trust. When we trust public health experts, it's because we think they'll follow the evidence where it leads and not use the authority of their profession to advance their personal political priorities, for example. And so you see where that's going in looking at 2020, which was an awful year for expertise, because it was a year in which people we wanted and needed to trust, not just people we were told to trust, but we felt we needed to be able to trust somebody on what's going on here. Those very people continuously escape the constraints that ought to be imposed on them by their professions, by the institutions they're part of, and so again and again showed themselves not to be worthy of that trust. Now, that's not an excuse for escaping into conspiracy and fantasy, but it is a reason for doing so. And I think it helps us see that the revolt against elites in American life is a function in large part of the elites' evasion of responsibility, and particularly of the responsibility that comes with power. And that is a crucial part of what institutions do. They impose the responsibility that comes with power. So to me, that lesson applies to a lot more than expertise. It cuts to the core of our loss of confidence in institutions in American life, and to the core of the populist moment that we live in. It gives us a sense that the people with power in our society are not constrained by any obligation to that society, so that a recovery would have to involve some kind of recovery of institutional responsibility, which, and maybe this is the hopeful part of me, it's easy to say, well, that's impossible. Those people would never do it. But if it starts with us, if it starts with individuals who can say, given the role that I have in this institution that I'm part of, what should I be doing here? Then I do think it's imaginable that you could start to see both a greater demand for that kind of responsibility and a greater expression of that kind of responsibility in various parts of American life. Whether it's possible or not, that's where my hope lies. That's what a recovery would look like. And I think in the wake of 2020, it's clearer than ever how big the problem is. And so it's clearer than ever that we need a solution on that front. And, in that sense, I'd say the argument of the book should strike all the more precisely on the problem points we have. But obviously the year has also been proof that the problem is deep and broad and serious. And if you're looking for arguments for despair, this wasn't a bad year for those either.
Good. That just exactly the balance of hope and cold-eyed realism that I was looking for from you, Yuval. So now for the even colder-eyed take, I want to turn to Chris, because Chris's book was also about sort of structural changes in the American Republic between the 1960s and the present. But Chris, you made in a way, I think, a more ideological argument than Yuval, sort of focused on the extent to which, in your telling, the United States has, for reasons that began with the logic of the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, but have since extended themselves dramatically across a range of groups, identities, basically all of the cultural forces that we think of as making up modern liberalism. Through this process, the US has replaced or partially replaced its older constitution, which focused on, to some significant degree, the protection of individual liberties, to a new constitution that is focused much more on the balancing of group interests and the protection of group rights, with those groups, again, being, racial initially, but sort of extending in broader groups to encompass, in your telling, just about everybody except perhaps white males. And so, and your book ends, I think, on a more pessimistic note than Yuval's not optimistic but hopeful book, in the sense that, having told this story, you sort of end by saying, well, look, in certain ways, the reasonable answer or the reasonable position that conservatives should take in this moment is to consider going all the way back to the source and repealing the major legislation that sort of set this process in motion, which means the Civil Rights Acts, the sort of most inviolable part of, I would say, modern American legislation in certain ways, which seemed to me as a reader kind of like a council of despair. So I'm curious that would be my question to you a year ago. How despairing are you actually? My question to you now, though, is how vindicated do you feel by the sort of ideological drama that has played out within liberalism against the backdrop of sort of institutional failure that you've all described? Because I will say that when I read your book for the first time, I thought you placed race too close to the center of sort of modern liberalism, self-understanding and purposes. And obviously we've just gone through a year where, against the backdrop of the coronavirus, race has sort of rushed to the center of liberal arguments, liberal agitation, and conflict within liberal institutions themselves. So I guess a twofold question: are you despairing, and are you vindicated? And your microphone is off, Chris. Just so you know, you're muted.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Ross, and thank you, and thank the Institute for Human Ecology for having me. It's great to be here and it's an honor to be here with both you and Yuval. Well, I would say I'm not. I'm not sure I would agree with the characterization of the book as really being about race or about group rights. I don't think that that's necessarily the core of what was done with the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which I do agree is at the center of my book. I think that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it didn't have any idea of real group rights in it, of the, as you would in, say, the Indian Constitution or something. It had the idea of stopping Americans from doing something that I think had become sort of morally intolerable to them and did not fit in institutionalized racial discrimination, and particularly segregation. And although my book is not, I believe, ideological, it does trace the evolution of that type of government that was set up in the early 1960s over the course of a half century. I don't have the time to go into it in great detail, but basically the argument is that the remit kept expanding, that from trying to fix sort of segregation in Mississippi and Alabama, the Civil Rights Act sort of spread its view, and this was in the statute. This was not so much of a stretch, to the whole country. It also increased the things that were considered discrimination, and it increased the punishments for those. And so the Civil Rights Act became a very powerful tool, not just for fixing Jim Crow, but also for fixing other problems. And so activists who felt themselves poorly treated in some way or another involving disadvantage or discrimination were no longer patient enough to wait for legislation. So, to take a couple of familiar examples, women who felt that they should be promoted to the executive level of a corporation more quickly, or immigrants who felt that schools were not fair to them. You could say to those people, well, if you're not happy, why don't you go out and try and vote a law? But increasingly, they were not content with that. And so the Civil Rights Act and the laws built on it became a kind of a style of government, which gradually, I think, came to be used to overrule the old style of government. What happened in the COVID year, I think, is maybe most obvious in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing and the protests and the riots that resulted from it. When you had this enormous movement of the society as one to censor and purge pretty much every corporate institution in the country, in order to somehow sort of rectify some racial wrong, although it was never really clear what that racial wrong was, because when when the New Orleans Saints made Drew Brees go out and apologize for saying that he did not approve of kneeling during the national anthem, I don't think they felt any particular responsibility for what happened in Minneapolis to George Floyd. And indeed, I don't think the New Orleans Saints as an institution have any real need to feel they owe anyone an apology at all when it comes to race. But there it was. So I would say, I don't necessarily believe this is a question of race. I believe it's a question of a new style of government imposed quite indirectly from above, which has gradually now become the foundation of the way we live.
So I want to bring you guys sort of effectively into conversation with each other, if I can. But let me take up that last point, Chris, right? Because yeah, I guess in my framing, I suggested that Yuval was focused heavily on institutions, and by calling your book ideological, I meant that it was sort of more focused on the working out of ideas. But I think it's, in certain ways, your book arguably is more sort of institutionally focused than Yuval's, and to the extent that Yuval is sort of describing a decline, a weakening, and emptying out of institutions. And part of your point is that we created sort of de novo a set of institutions, sort of extra constitutional, quasi-constitutional institutions in the 60s. In effect, a sort of set of laws but legal procedures sort of managed through the bureaucracy and the courts that have become obviously much more institutionally powerful and have set the tone for how Americans argue about, talk about, think about race, sex, religion, a whole raft of things. Yeah. So in that sense, you sort of have more confidence than you've all in institutions. And I want to press you on the last point, which is that to me, what's striking about the last year is sort of how deinstitutionalized the anti-racism is, in the sense that when the moment arrived for Drew Brees to, go out and make a mea culpa, or when the moment arrived for, the editor of Bon Appetit, or, whichever, the leaders of the Poetry Foundation, whichever sort of group happened to be embattled. When that moment arrived, nobody was filing an anti-discrimination claim with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or anything like that, right? I mean, this was a cultural movement that worked itself out, almost exclusively through sort of demands and responses, in effect, that it had sort of transcended the institutional structures on which it had built. And you're shaking your head good. So tell me why you think that's wrong.
No, I think you're right that we created a new set of institutions ab ovo, but I think we have not yet figured out what those institutions are. The problem with the civil rights institutions is that they were driven largely by litigation, right? We created a lot of new crimes. We hugely staffed up the federal government's investigative and litigative apparatus, and we encouraged a sort of the country to be the eyes and ears of civil rights enforcement. That's the new institution that we created that's really important. I think that when we look at our country constitutionally, we tend to look at the basic tripartite structure of an executive, legislative, and judiciary, but we forget that within the judiciary branch, lawsuits have become a way of actually driving social change. And one of the results of, well, let's just say, one thing that was implicit in 1964, and one of the things that critics of the Civil Rights Act warned against, and it turns out rightly in retrospect, was the erosion of the boundary between public and private. You know, there was a lot of discussion about whether, you know, it should be only public discrimination that was that was made illegal, or whether private discrimination should be too. We wound up with a kind of a way for the government to look into private businesses. And that, accompanied with our litigating habits, with our tendency to sue people whom we're not happy with, that created a great vulnerability for companies. And as judges began to comment on and actually rework the civil rights litigation, companies and other private individuals got more and more and more vulnerable to being destroyed by litigation. And that had sociological, or that had consequences for the corporate sociology of the country. You had the building up of large human resources departments, which spent much of their time trying to protect their corporations from anti-discrimination lawsuits. And you had a buildup of doctrines, including, let's say, hostile environment doctrine, which meant that the culture of a company, independent of whether anyone even meant to discriminate in any way, could render a company vulnerable. And the opinions of the of the members of that company or corporation could count as part of that corporate culture. So when activists began knocking at the door of New Orleans Saints, they were scared. And so you have these, pretty much every private organization, every private corporation in the country is now running interference for the federal government. And this creates a very complex dynamic, because it doesn't look like the government is doing anything at all. But it is. And I think it's important to understand that it is. It is actually empowered through civil rights. It has empowered corporations to do things like, you know, enforce free speech and that sort of thing. I think this is a top-down thing. It's just at a kind of an indirect. It's at one remove.
Russ, I wonder if I can speak to that. I think I very much agree with the way that Chris started to get at this by saying that there's more to the Constitution than the three branches of government, the familiar picture. It's worth our seeing our Constitution in almost a classical sense as describing our way of life and providing us with a vocabulary for understanding the relations between parts of our society. And there's always been a way, in the United States in particular, where we use the terminology of our Constitution to describe elements and facets of our culture, so that when when the student movement arose in the early 60s, it reached for the language of free speech, which it had very little really to do with, but it needed a way to describe its agenda and its energy. And the natural place to go was the language, the vocabulary of the Constitution. I think there is a way that what Chris describes as a kind of new Constitution, or I would say a new phase of American constitutionalism, that was created by those supermajorities of the mid-60s. And really a lot of what we're living with in American politics now is a function of those supermajorities doing things that just regular majorities can't undo, whether that's in our entitlement system or whether that's in these civil rights debates. They created a new set of terms for describing the forces that are at work in American life. And you find those forces now at work on their own. I don't think it's quite right to say that they're acting on behalf of the government. I think they are acting independently on an understanding of what our Constitution is, broadly understood, of what the principles of American life are. And some of those are embodied in institutions. And, there's you can't help but be formed by institutions. And if they are deformed, then they deform you. So that a lot of younger Americans now going through the universities and encountering a mode of administration that uses this idea of social justice as a way of using power, which is what university administrators do now. Those students emerge from those institutions understanding that as the way that administration works. And then they go and work for the New York Times, or they go and work for the New Orleans Saints, or they go and work for Wall Street firms. And, all the people in all those places come out of the same fairly small number of universities. They walk out with an idea of what administration looks like that involves this kind of way of applying power to advance a worldview and to demand conformity to that view. And they then expect other institutions in American life to work that way. And I think this is all related to the changes in legal culture and political culture that Chris describes. But I wouldn't say that it's top down in the sense that it's responding to government pressure.
Yes.
It's living in a culture transformed by political change.
Yuval, I think I was, if I used the word behalf, I want to be, I was unclear. I don't mean the government is ordering corporations to carry out its policy. What I mean is that it created, it criminalized certain behaviors in 1964. And not in any centralized way, but in a way having to do with the culture of the judiciary, which is an elite, well-educated culture. That those criminalized activities were kind of elaborated to the point where they reach into more and more areas of private life. For institutions that have a lot at stake in a lawsuit, that is, universities with large endowments, corporations with sort of like with heavily invested shareholders, they have a fiduciary responsibility of not having all their money taken away. And so they tend to respond to threats that come from litigation in this larger, in this large sort of complex of hard to determine criminalized behaviors. They tend to respond very seriously. When I say this is top down, I don't mean that they're being commanded to behave in a certain way. I mean they are responding to incentives that were created by the government.
I wonder, Chris, and sorry to kind of take over us, but I wonder, one thought I had in reading your argument, reading your book, is that ironically, the judiciary is the one institution in our system that is in better shape today than it was in 1970 because of a transformation basically wrought by the Federalist Society and others. The debates within the judiciary today are basically a yes or no question about originalism, which is an idea that didn't even exist in 1970. And if the power that you're describing was ultimately rooted in judicial overaction, is there some hope in the transformation of the judiciary that we're living through, part of which we've seen, more of which we'll see, I think, in the years to come?
I defer to you on matters of hope. I think that your definition of hope is a good one. Of course, there's hope.
But Yuval, actually, though, let me press you on that last point, right? Because let's suppose that we take the claim seriously that what Chris describes as beginning in administration and sort of, lawsuits and bureaucracy and so on has become a culture, that a sort of constitutional culture, as you describe it, that isn't necessarily dependent on those mechanisms. Then it seems like the court itself exists within that constitutional culture. And so, for instance, when it comes time for a conservative Supreme Court, selected with Federalist Society input to rule on whether the Civil Rights Act covers gay and transgender Americans, for instance, right? it rules enough conservative justices rule in accordance with the new constitutional understanding, at least in that case. I know obviously there were sort of, textualist claims and so on, but that seems to me to be what happened in that ruling, that the power of the new constitution was such that at least two conservative justices felt, impelled to sort of conform their analysis to it. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think that's largely right. I guess my own answer to my own question would be that real hope would require an analogous process in the legislature to what we've seen in the courts over the last half century, which is the revival of an understanding of the purpose of the institution that ultimately amounts to a kind of recovery of American constitutionalism. I think what conservatives brought about in the courts is the instantiation of a set of ideas that leads to a restrained judiciary, which would have been useful in 1975 to avoid some of the things that Chris is describing, but which now, of course, ends up being weak in the face of all that has transpired as a result of what Chris is describing. And yet, I think that that's the right role for the judge. And so the challenge we face is that right now, the failure in our system, and this gets back to the argument of my book too, the failure in our system is a failure of Congress. The problems we have in our constitutional system now, whether that be problems with the courts or with the executive branch, the administrative state, are almost all functions of a willfully underactive Congress. And we're in a situation that to me seems analogous to the early 1970s, where what's required is first and foremost a kind of intellectual project, a return to the roots that help us understand the purpose of Congress, which I would venture to say that if you ask members of Congress today what the purpose of the institution is, the answers would not be sources of hope for the likes of me. And ultimately, the purpose of Congress is to enable accommodation and compromise and bargaining in a divided society. And there is no other institution in our society that has that purpose. And we've basically lost sight of that being the purpose of Congress. Even people who want to reform Congress now don't think that's what they're trying to achieve. So that we're at a point now that, to me, again, seems analogous to where Scalia and Bork and others were in relation to the courts in 1972, but in relation to Congress. We require a recovery of the fundamental purpose of the institution. And the way to answer the kinds of changes that Chris describes through the mold of constitutional change would have to be focused on some recovery of the idea of Congress. I think that's the focus for conservative constitutionalists, but that's a generation-long project. And in the meantime, there are fights to be had in the culture and within all of our institutions that look like a recovery of institutional integrity in a way that is binding on elites. And that fight has to be had within the environment, the context that Chris describes. And so it's no small challenge. But, my hope is ultimately rooted in my sense that things have gotten very bad. I don't think there are a lot of Americans who are happy with the status quo. And even though we disagree about what that means and in what direction that should point, it seems to me this is a moment that can argue for some change and that can begin from a sense that people feel like things have gotten off track. And the question for those of us who want to begin from hope and let it drive us towards some action is what can be made of that dissatisfaction, and how do we help transform it from just sheer unhappiness and despair into some project, into some way of acting on the Constitution broadly understood of our society in such a way that actually speaks to these problems. I do think our politics is struggling for such ways, but it hasn't found them.
But then let me pose a provocation to you, and this is, Chris, you can answer this as well. What if what we saw in elite institutions over the last year, the sort of zealous anti-racism, to distill it to a couple words, is in fact that quest for integrity?
Yeah.
taking the only shape that it plausibly can, right? Because my experience of elite institutions over 20 to 25 years of adult life is that they existed with some of Chris's characteristics, right? A sort of, a cautious litigation averse management of multiculturalism, joined to, tons of, extremely cynical careerism and empty meritocratic self-interest of the kind that I think you describe as, part of what's gone wrong with institutions. And so a lot of what's happened with activism on the left, it seems to me, is, an attempt to take institutions that really have no conservative constitutive character anymore at all, that sort of exist in between these sort of anti-racist piety and meritocratic self-interest, and try to make them sort of coherent and idealistic, and say, look, instead of having these institutions that only act against racial discrimination because they fear the lawsuits and bureaucracy in the way Chris describes, we want them to be anti-racist in full. We want them to be passionate gospel believers in the truths of intersectionality. That seems to me to be part of what's happening, and I'm curious what you both think of that scenario. That this is the renewal, just not the one conservatives
exactly
were
right.
hoping for.
I think you're right, or at least I would say I think that this is evidence of a hunger for renewal, but whether it actually is the renewal, depends on whether this enables those institutions to function and serve their purposes in society, which I don't think it will. So, to me, this suggests an opportunity. Listening to college students talk the way college students talk now, I just can't help think, and you'll forgive this Jewish American saying it, I just can't help think these people are just begging to be converted to Christianity, and somebody needs to step up and do that. And there is plainly a desire for justice and for some idea that will guide our society towards a deeper understanding of the good. I give them that credit. I think they mean it. But what they're being offered isn't going to achieve that. And so it seems to me that actually is an opening for something like renewal. And that it even sees itself as being that renewal, but I don't think it can succeed because it misunderstands the purposes of these institutions. And sorry, Chris, I jumped in.
Yeah, no, I'd say I think that's a good characterization. If I were a pessimist, we were talking earlier about sort of like our institutions sort of like taking new forms. You could say that maybe we do have our 21st century institutions. It's just that they do not contain much free speech, and they do not contain much of a role for the common man.
So why don't we, it's 2:43, so why don't we pivot from that to questions? And I think, let me just see. Yeah, so here's a question that I think picks up a little bit where Chris was leaving off. It's from Derek Webb, and he asks, so are problems with our institutions, whether the courts, the universities, or the administrative state, ultimately downstream from American culture? And if so, ought not the ultimate focus for those interested in rebuilding the republic be on cultural issues, the people themselves and their civic education, habits, and mores? What do you guys think of that?
No, my answer is no. I don't disagree with I don't agree with the view most commonly expressed by Steve Bannon, I believe, that politics is downstream of culture. I think it is in certain it is in certain societies and at certain times, but I think that in this particular issue where we're talking about the abuses of litigation, political and political correctness, I think that the culture is downstream of politics. I would have one qualifier though. I think that it's useful to think what the role of television is in all of this, in having conditioned this revolution and made it all possible in its effect on attention spans. I think that has done a lot, as Yuval realizes, to create this transformation of our institutions into platforms.
Well, I guess I would say that I am closer to agreeing with the original form of that expression, which comes from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which Bannon left half out of. Moynihan said politics is downstream of culture, but politics practiced properly can shape the culture. And I think there's truth to that. And for me, it returns to that broader sense of constitution. I return to it, forgive me, because it's the next book I'm writing, but I think that there's a way of understanding our politics and culture as existing in a kind of interaction with each other, in which they unavoidably shape one another, so that it matters to the culture what happens in our politics, how we understand where legitimacy comes from, the shape and function of our institutions. Politics shapes culture to a tremendous degree, and I think this is especially true in the United States. Americans have always understood our identity as connected to our Constitution in what is a very bizarre way. And I think we actually take a lot of our national identity from our political institutions. And so it matters a great deal what's happening in those institutions. But I think it's simply obviously true that those institutions also exist within an environment that is tremendously shaped by the currents of the culture. And it would be impossible to deny that what's happened in our politics in the past decade has been a kind of mode of cultural expression, at least as much as it has been actually a practice of politics in any traditional sense.
This question's from an anonymous attendee. How would you both define civil society? Would you consider it an institution? And what's the role of civil society vis-a-vis formal institutions in the United States? And for that matter, what is the current state of civil society?
It's kind of a trick question, actually, I think, because those who invoke civil society tend to represent the organized part of civil society, that is foundations and that sort of thing. And this is a very interesting question that takes us into the shape of whether we have a new modern constitution, because if we do, then foundations are very important in it. Let's say the nonprofit sector more generally, universities, because foundations in the nonprofit sector are, to say something is tax exempt is to say it's basically subsidized. So it does have a sort of it's a half official role in society. So that is there. I don't think that there's any such organic thing as civil society. I think there's society, which means the people just going about their business. But I think generally when we talk about civil society, we're talking about the nonprofit sector.
Well, I largely agree with that. I think I would say that civil society describes the space between the individual and the state, and also what fills that space. And so that, for the most part, it's a way of talking about that arena in which a variety of institutions that are not the government operate. And that they're institutions means they're more than just individuals. And that they're not the government means they describe, in our kind of society, a very, very broad array of institutions. I think some of those can be formal corporate organizations. Some of those are much less formalized kinds of social structures, from the family on up. And I would say that Americans have always cared to an unusual degree about or have always sought to understand our society in terms of civil society, and have thought about the government and its role as existing to sustain that space in which civil society happens, rather than as filling that space, as actually being the action society takes. Now that's changed over time. We're less that way than we used to be. But I think it's still the case that there's a distinctly American view that says that civil society is what government exists to protect and sustain. And it's ultimately how we actually function, how we interact with each other, and where most of our institutions are. The government has crowded some of that out. I think that an increasingly radical kind of individualism through the second half of the 20th century also acted to crowd that out some, and these things work in tandem. Centralization of political power and individualism in the culture are two sides of one coin. And I think the alternative to those is something like a communitarianism that puts civil society at the center. I would say that's the view that I try to advance and that I think is essential to the flourishing of the American way of life. But, you know, it's too broad and large to describe it as a single institution. I think it's more than that. Maybe it's an arena in which most of our institutions operate.
Let me zero in. I think this question, I'll adapt it to make it particularly for Yuval. It's from Abi K. And it's a practical question. What practical everyday advice do you have for younger people about rebuilding institutions when seemingly their peers around them are focused on tearing them down? And I want to make it a question about Congress, because you like to bring up, you already brought up, you know, the potential revival and renewal of Congress. What advice do you give to congressmen and congresswomen who want Congress to function again, who are not in leadership and who share their institution, I think it's definitely fair to say, with peers who are interested in tearing what you consider important about Congress down?
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate the modification, since it also makes the question much easier and less impossible to answer. I think what's important, and this in a way does apply more broadly to being an institutionalist, I think you have to come in with an understanding of the purpose of the institution that you're part of. Its role, its goal, its ideal of integrity, its kind of purpose, rather than see it as a place to elevate yourself, as a place to build your own brand, as a place to get a bigger following. Think about what it is you can do through the institution as an insider. And I think that the advice that I press to members of Congress, the few who are interested in such advice, is to see yourself as an insider, which is now the hardest thing to do in American life. There is enormous pressure and a very powerful and understandable desire to understand yourself as an outsider, as a critic of power, as standing outside the establishment and telling it to be better. But a member of Congress is not an outsider. A member of Congress is an insider with enormous power. And it's important to think about how that power can be used inside the institution. And so to ask yourself what you can do for your district, what you can do to help the Congress be stronger in relation to the other parts of the government, what you can do to advance the ideas that brought you into politics to begin with, using the power that you have as a member of Congress. There's actually a lot of room to do that because there is not a lot of competition right now for being an active legislator in our legislature. A Republican member of Congress who wants to be the policy star of the party can just go walk right in and take it because that title is lying on the floor. There's simply not a lot of interest in being an institutionalist within Congress. And I think there's both a niche for that, so it can speak to people's ambition, and politicians are ambitious people. But there's also a very great need for it because ultimately the system can't function, and the kinds of criticisms of it made by outsiders can't be answered unless insiders take seriously the responsibility they have and see it as defined by the shape of the institution. So a member of Congress should want to be a legislator, which means should want to advance his idea of what is good for the country through the mode of bargaining and deal making and negotiating with people who have a different idea of what's good for the country. That, in essence, is what you should try to do if you have the misfortune of finding yourself a member of Congress.
But do everything in your power to avoid ending up in that.
Well, look, it's a good thing that there are people who want such things.
Exactly.
I don't understand them, but I'm glad they exist.
So here's a question from Margaret Emerson that I'm going to reframe for Chris. She asks, what do the speakers think are the causes of the events of January 6th, 2021, the riot at the US Capitol? And I want to put this to you, Chris, because I think it's fair to say that you've been at least somewhat more sympathetic to the Trump presidency, or were somewhat more sympathetic to the Trump presidency than Yuval and I throughout. And your book, while it does not mention Trump by name, I think, or it sort of ends at the point that he begins his run for president, certainly offers, a pretty powerful explanation for the kind of discontents that led to his ascent. So I'm wondering what you think about the end game of the Trump presidency, both the riot, but also sort of the general way that Trump went out, and how it shapes your thinking about the prospects for populism going forward, for a politics animated by resistance to the new constitution that you describe, whatever.
Well, I mean, that's a
You have
very
30 seconds.
large,
30
that's
seconds.
a very large set of questions. First of all, to dispense with populism, I think these are, because of the structural issues we've been discussing, there is a rich banquet of issues on which populism can thrive still throughout the world, here and elsewhere, you know. Now, whether Trump has certainly been damaged by the end of his presidency, whether he will play a part in that, I don't know. You know, I don't know exactly what you mean by being more sympathetic to his presidency, but I certainly, I think I see the reasons why he was elected, and I think the rationale for which he was elected is still present. The events since the election are really, really confusing, because Trump was the subject to an almost constant vilification as a corrupt and illegitimate president. He was sort of attacked pretty much throughout his presidency by people who attempted to show him guilty of serious high crimes and misdemeanors. And I would say mostly without effect. I mean, I don't think they succeeded in proving their case. But then in the last 60 days of his presidency, he went out and tried to steal an election, and wound up proving their case beyond any shadow of a doubt, beyond their wildest dreams. Now, here I think we need to distinguish between three stages of that process. It was not illegitimate to, say, I would like a second look at the election and how the votes were counted and that kind of thing. All this is a complicated thing. Where Trump really went provably, culpably, convictably wrong was in doing things like the phone call he made to the Georgia Secretary of State. That was trying to steal an election. Trump's role in the in January 6th is unfortunate. It's kind of ambiguous. It would be hard to prove actual culpability in a court of law. But I would say that when it comes to January 6th, if this is the burden of the questioner's question, I don't blame the people gathered for January 6th. I think people are free, are constitutionally free to assemble and speak about whatever they like. There were certainly bad actors in the crowd. I would blame the individual bad actors. There was unfortunately, there were some policing problems, but I would not blame the crowd as a whole or leap to the conclusion that there was anything illegitimate about the gathering of the crowd.
So it's 2:59. But let me just quickly take the prerogative of going one last step further and try and lift up from that with a question for both of you, right? Because you've both written books from a conservative perspective about the institutions of the United States in a time when conservatism in those institutions, I think up to and including institutions like the US military, we got one question about the US military, right? Sort of the paradigmatic conservative institution in some sense, currently engaging in some kind of weird Twitter war with Tucker Carlson, right, over his criticisms. In all of these institutions, conservatism seems incredibly marginal, not everywhere, but in many, many institutions. And I'm wondering, as just a place to finish for both of you, what does that mean for conservatives? And maybe it's a version of the question posed to Yuval about, what the individual member of Congress should do. But what should conservatives who are trying to rebuild or think seriously about American institutions make of their marginal position within those institutions, and how should they act in that context? Either one of you.
Well, I think that, of course, that is the question. And it's surely true that conservatives are more marginalized in more institutions now than we're used to being and have been in some time. There are some institutions where we feel especially marginalized, where we've probably always been marginalized. The university has never, well, maybe not never, but certainly not in my lifetime, belonged to the right in any way. And yet to be marginalized and to be almost forcibly excluded are different things. And I think that in situations like that, we face the question of whether to fight for a foothold in elite institutions or whether to fight to create alternative institutions. And I'm inclined to say, yes, we should do both of those things, that it is actually very important to have a foothold, even if it will be only that, in mainstream institutions, in elite institutions, call them whatever you want, that it is very important that some of those students whose parents send them to Princeton to get a degree actually end up being transformed by Robbie George. I think that's enormously important in our elite institutions, even if it is even if they have less of a presence than ever. And it is also worthwhile to think about what kinds of institutions need to be built in a time when, in fact, a large swath of American society is excluded from self-described and self-understood elite institutions, so that it is both an opportunity and a need to create some alternatives. And we have had periods of alternative institution building, even in higher education. Institutions like the University of Chicago, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, Duke came about at the end of the 19th century out of dissatisfaction, basically among a few wealthy people, dissatisfaction in Harvard and Yale, where they sent their kids and they weren't happy with what happened. That kind of moment does happen. It can happen. And we need to think about what alternative institutions look like. But there's also a cost to building alternatives. And the cost can look like living in echo chambers where we only talk to ourselves. And that has its own risks. It comes with real dangers. And so I think conservatives cannot give up on the mainstream culture, on the elite culture, on institutions that are dominated by the left, but where it is essential that there be some other voices, even as we also have to ask ourselves, where can we raise our kids? Where can we live our lives? Where can we not always be at war, but can actually live? Both those questions demand answers in the situation we're in now.
Yes, I think that's the key. The inability to withdraw from this ideological project that our government institutions are now engaged in is the most dangerous thing, because it does delegitimize those institutions. The idea that a branch of the military, that members of a branch of a military in their official capacities would attack a journalist ad hominem is not a silly thing. It's a grave. It's a very serious breach of institutional ethics. And so, look, the less we have of this, the better, because at a certain point, this type of exclusionary conduct becomes delegitimizing in itself. I mean, so I'll leave it at that.
All right, a suitably, wildly optimistic place to end. So just a couple of things. First, I just want to thank Chris and Yuval. We only sadly scratched the surface of the sort of discussion and arguments implied by their two terrific books. Again, Chris's is The Age of Entitlement. Yuval's is A Time to Build. You can purchase them both either from the great monopolist, Amazon.com, or maybe better, your local independent bookseller, which is definitely part of civil society, however we define the term. I also just want to thank the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic U for sponsoring this event. I should note that I think the next IHE event is in a couple of days at 6:30 p.m. It's entitled More Work, Fewer Babies. What does workism have to do with falling fertility? And you can find that on IHE's website. And, you know, it's another subject that I think connects to some of the issues that we've talked about today. So thanks to IHE for hosting this, and thanks to all of you for joining it. Of course, we can't see any of you because, you know, this is the age of Zoom, but we'd feel pretty silly if you weren't here with us today. So again, Yuval and Chris, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
everyone else, enjoy your afternoon.